I'm Michael Gibson, and I am the Chief Curator and Director of Programs at the Contemporary Dayton. Today, we're speaking with somebody that we're currently exhibiting, Jeffery Gibson, who was born in Colorado Springs, Colorado in 1972, and currently lives and works at various places in New York, in the Hudson Valley area, and if I'm not mistaken, in Brooklyn as well. And Jeffery is renowned for his richly patterned and embellished hung textiles, and more recently for these Everlast punching bags, which people seem to respond to immediately. And they draw inspiration from an amalgam of subcultures. But interestingly, to me, anyway, they tend to, through an intense intentionality and presence, push their way almost out of that realm and into the immediate experience of those who are viewing them. So they seem to me to retain both. They draw heavily from these cultures. If you want to call them subcultures, that's great. But they speak immediately to people of all kinds who are in the room with them, essentially, which is one of the things about the work that I have loved since I first experienced it at the Greater New York Show in 2016. And that show had, your work had an immediate impact for me in that context. It seemed to be completely out of the context of everything around it. But I knew it was sort of doing what I think this work does, which is draw from a number of sources in an incredibly germane way to speak to this moment. And I guess I'd like to start by, first of all, stating that Jeffery is represented in many important and august collections, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Denver Art Museum, and Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, and is, over the past few years, has shown across America many times and globally, and is a MacArthur Fellow, which I think also points to the idea that it's a distinction for me that points directly to this idea that you are able to take this amalgam of ideas and turn them into a thing that's immediately able to speak to this incredibly broad audience. So with that, I would say, Jeffery, welcome.
Thank you.
I generally have started these talks with asking people about how they came to art, and everyone's experience with art and with art education seems to be a little bit different. Sometimes traditional and sometimes not. And I'm curious about how you came to be who you are as an artist.
I mean, I was drawing when I was very young, like 3 or 4 years old. I think I always was given, like crayons and paper, and whether it was in church or on an airplane, because we moved around so much, I was just always drawing, and I was very encouraged by my parents. And I guess, that continued through elementary school, middle school, high school. I led like an art club in my high school, and that's kind of when I started knowing more about, artists. This was in the 80s, so mainly artists working in New York. I knew of a New York art world probably through things like Interview Magazine, which was really big, and that's kind of, in many ways, influenced my perspective of what I thought the art world was as a teenager. And we lived in a few different places. So we lived in the United States, in a few different states, and then Germany and Korea. And anytime we were traveling, my parents would take us to, whether it was musical symphonies or museums, and even, going to visit our families in Mississippi and Oklahoma. we would go to fairs, or I would visit powwows. And so there was always some element of things that had been made, and culture and music, that I remember throughout my childhood. And when I went to college, I think I was a little. That's sort of when it became really challenging to understand what it meant to be an artist. And I went to the University of Maryland for 1 year and got kicked out, because I think I really didn't know how to pursue being an artist. And I ended up going to a community college after that in Maryland, and I was just in the art department, all the time. My professors loved me because I was that student who just couldn't get enough. And my painting professor, Barbara Johnson, advised me to look into the Art Institute of Chicago. And I still didn't really know how to distinguish that from anything else. I think I was a little disappointed that it wasn't New York. But I went to Chicago and had a lot of autonomy. It was a time in Chicago where it was extremely cheap to live. I lived in Wicker Park. I had a 6-bedroom apartment. I worked with Susan Doremus and Jim Lutz as my primary professors for, probably about 2.5 years. And they would come to my apartment and we would have my critiques there. So I was really kind of independently working. That's also when I started working at the Field Museum. And I was working on NAGPRA, which is as a research assistant, which is the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And that, I think, informs a lot of the content of my work, and just kind of being with that, being in that environment with historic objects. And in that particular time, tribal delegations coming to visit them for potential repatriation, really, the language involved in that, the negotiations involved in that, the misrepresentations involved in that, really have become kind of the core of, kind of how I think. So then, I went to Royal College at the suggestion of a friend of mine, an artist friend named Sana Mokajetto, and she said I should go to London. And fortunately, my tribe, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, agreed to pay for my time abroad for 3 years. And so I went there, and it was kind of, it was in the 90s. That was the early 90s. So identity politics here in the U.S. felt a little kind of overwhelming to me. And I felt kind of unable and stunted to make work. And when I went to London, all of that was not present, or it was present in a different way, I should say. And then I came back to the United States in 1999, moved to New York, and I guess it was a real struggle for about 10 years of trying to figure out how to approach being an artist. And that's really when most of my work that I'm known for today really started. And it was really trying to figure out how to tell this kind of very layered, dense narrative of multiplicity and of hybridity, and in particular, with at the core of it being some sort of kind of contemporary Native American identity. And the punching bag was probably the very first piece that, it had that immediacy that you referred to. And that was very exciting for me. I was like, people got it, and they got it not only in my story, my narrative that I gave in the making of it, but also themselves. A lot of people could see their own personal struggles in it. So that was a format, that kind of worked. And I feel like that is something that it's a big part of how I determine whether an artwork is successful or not, is the degree to which people want to engage with it. And I know a lot of artists don't feel that way, but for me, I do think of what I do as kind of a complicated communication. And I do want people to kind of feel and engage.
Interestingly, a couple things. First of all, I'm curious as to why your family traveled so much. I mean, were you a military family, or?
Yes, my father was a civil engineer with the Department of Defense, so that's how we moved around.
Okay. I too am a military brat, and so traveled, moved every 18 months around the world.
Yeah.
and so I can identify with that. But and also I'm curious if this experience you had at community college seemed to be a transformational experience, which I think is an experience that is almost the secret of the art world often. I think about Mark Bradford and other people who went to community college. Nowhere else but a community college would you run into a professor in the 80s or early 90s or whatever it was who would talk to you about Chicago.
Right.
And these are the kind of dialogues that happen in those places because they're not so obsessed with perhaps the most pertinent idea of the moment. And an exploration of Judy Chicago's work for a student like that at that time seems totally very, very important. It's a huge idea to explore, and I think that's probably important for a lot of people to hear. The other thing I'm really curious about is if your engagement with Mississippi Band of Choctaw and Cherokee traditions really began with that project in Chicago. You said you had gone to powwows with your family before, but did it begin in earnest there?
Well, I'll start with the community college. I recommend people go to community colleges regularly when they're kind of trying to figure out. I mean, I think the art world is very intimidating to a lot of people, at many different stages, and I think it's. I find that professors who teach at community colleges are usually very technically able, and kind of it's just like, let's just learn how to paint, let's just learn how to mix paint, let's just learn the technical aspects of things. And I have taught for nearly 20 years now, and I don't find that always when we go into like art schools, So for instance, one of my favorite things to teach is, level 100 painting and drawing. And I teach at Bard College right now, and people are like, people who went to the Art Institute with me, they're like, oh, you know how to draw? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, well, didn't you go to the Art Institute? And I said, yeah, but I transferred there. Really where I learned how to paint and draw was at this community college, Prince George's County Community College, just outside of DC. And my professors were great, and they were really, I think in a weird way, I remember one professor, I can't remember, David Smith, I think was his name, but not the David Smith that people might know, but, he was showing in New York, and it was a really big deal. He would talk about going to New York City and seeing his name on the side of a window on the Upper West Side. And I just remember thinking, I was like, that wasn't common. Everybody else was very content, making work day to day in their studios, and also having a personal life, and having a family. And and then I think, as far as if I understood your question correctly, I think that the kind of, I did grow up. I remember, I don't know if it was me or my mother or relatives would give me like postcards of Native American artists, and I would redraw them. I would draw them for people, family members mainly, and I think the kind of mix of them comes about, I think, because you really were, or I really felt like I was crossing a line. There were two distinct art worlds. There were Native American artists, and then there were non-Native American artists. And because I've grown up in a really kind of global perspective environment, to me, it never felt like they needed to be separated. And so the goal, in many ways, became sort of like, how do I just insert this into, the world that I operate in every day? I don't know if that answers the question entirely, but I think
it does. I think it addresses this essential idea of hybridity in your work. Yeah. I think that people immediately are able to push past often what's written about the work in terms of where it comes from culturally to their own experience. I've noticed, for instance, we're showing To Feel Myself Beloved on the Earth here. And what's been really interesting about that is the amount of literature students who have come in who are apparently studying Raymond Carver. And then also immediately, Dayton has a pretty robust queer culture, and there were people there that people from those groups are coming out in earnest to see this work.
Wow.
In part because of the way we've written about it, but also because I think it has a reputation for having this as part of an integral part of its hybridity.
Yes.
And it's been really, it's opened up in a funny way new audiences for us. Actually, I'm very curious about a couple things before we get to the work that we're currently showing. And that was a show that I was lucky enough to see at the weirdest time possible, which was a show in Calgary called Time Carriers.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Which was at the
Esper Foundation.
The Esper Foundation, yeah. I have Canadian relatives and was actually in Canada visiting, traveled to see the work there. And to me, in terms of this idea of moving beyond what a garment can be, that seemed to be the best example that I've seen of that in your work to this point. Part of it was just scale.
Yeah.
So many of these garments so beautifully displayed. I thought they were beautifully layered, and you were able to almost understand what they were in terms of adornment. There's so much more than clothes. And they became an environment, which I think is maybe traditionally what their goal is, to kind of create this environment. I'm curious about how you felt about that show, and if you were involved in that installation. It was such a beautiful installation.
Yeah, no, I love the installation, and their installation team and Naomi Potter, the director there, were really, I think sometimes I don't always push the installations far enough. I feel like I've made the garments, we've done the performances, we've shot the video, not to put it so crudely, but like just hang it up, and then, but their exhibition designers were really sort of like, they were really thoughtful about, they said, well, what's your ideal way that they would be shown? I was like, well, the garments should always be elevated, like they're kind of floating. They're not meant to be sort of like day to day. They're not day wear, off the rack or anything. So, and then also we talked about a choir, this formation of a choir. And I think I said that simply in thinking about, like if you had 12 people standing there singing a song. But in fact, when you put 50 garments up and they did the math and they did the grid and they said, well, here's how much space it's going to occupy. I was almost kind of like, well, we don't need to do that much, and they were like, no, we think it looks amazing. And then they did it. And I think what was great about it was it reminded me of something maybe more like a clothes, like sheets, like being hung outside to dry, or which, makes me think about sun and air. It did, of course, resemble a choir. It also reminded me more of banners as opposed to something that you would wear. And I think the way that the text worked, and it felt overwhelming. And I remember them, we spaced them so that you could walk through them. You didn't just have to have only a frontal view, but to think about garments in a spatial way. And then the drums, even, again, I had never seen all 50 drums hung on a wall before. So to see them kind of reflect the garments in that way felt very, very powerful. And I think, and also there's so much red in the garments in general that they kind of, after the lighting happened, they really glowed. You got this sense of like the individual, the collective, and then there's this kind of atmospheric glow, which has become a big part of how I talk about installations now. And we're actually getting ready to show that piece again at Site Santa Fe. That'll open in May, and we're following.
Yeah, that sounds.
Yeah, we're following and we're going to redo the performance as well. but we're following pretty much a very similar installation because I really did love it. And on the other side of Esker Foundation, when we showed the garments, the photographs, and the quilts, same thing. I think they did an incredible job, and those garments are really meant to be seen more as individual sculptural objects. So I thought they worked really, really well, and yeah, I was very happy with that show.
It did another thing that then came to mind again when I saw the last New York show, and saw To Feel Myself Beloved in that context, which was, and it was a thing that actually happened here. You're currently being shown as part of kind of a troika of artists that includes Odili Donald Odita and this incredible painter named Heather Jones, who actually sews all of her paintings together. And when the mural that Odili put together was coming together, and Heather's works were going up, but something was missing, and then immediately when we turned the film on, what I realized is that the show is really about rhythm, as much as it is about anything. The rhythms and the patterns, the rhythms with regard to how the garments sort of are hung and speak to one another. And I'm curious, and there's so much rhythm in To Feel Myself Beloved as well. I mean, it is overpoweringly rhythmic in its nature, and our decision was to turn it up so that it could be throughout the other exhibitions. And I'm curious about how you feel about that, because even in a completely silent exhibition of your work, there's almost I don't know how I feel about the whole synesthetic component of it, but there seems to be something almost aural that occurs. Part of that is just the presence of the drums, perhaps, but I think it's more than that.
Yeah, I think this question of, like, it's not even a question, but the maybe it's more of a concept of narrative and kind of storytelling. Time Carriers was sort of about that and thinking about each person. I've spoken about myself as kind of a nexus of many things, as I think everybody is, and that performance is really an opportunity for people to kind of present that kind of single nexus point, but also kind of highlight all of these trajectories that lead to that one point. And then, of course, there's a continuation where they continue going in other directions. And so I think that is both what I think surprises the participants, because the participants sometimes they're very shy, and we do a workshop. We only do one, maybe we do two workshops focusing on breathing and voice and how to kind of enunciate and how to kind of project. And a lot of people they're not used to that. And it kind of shocks them. Like, I've seen people get really kind of emotional about it and kind of get shocked. And so I think that this kind of idea of what I present as an artwork or a performance or a video, it's meant to sort of continue unfolding into the environment. So when we're talking about sound, that is very literal. We can just turn the volume up and it will continue to filter around. And I think that especially when it comes to drumming and To Feel Myself Beloved on the Earth, we have different kinds of drumming, right? But it's like the idea that throughout the kind of arc of the video, there are moments when the drumming will literally activate your body differently because of the kind of drumming it is, because of the pace of the drumming. And then you add image, and then you add the individuals in the video, and then you add landscape. And so, and also, I'm very influenced by the period of MTV that I grew up with, where videos were becoming more cinematic and more And so I think when I make a video, I do oftentimes think about a soundtrack. I think about the kind of videography in terms of cinema, not just video art, for instance. So yeah, it's become a real part of everything.
Interesting because also the new museum show was interesting to me because I ended up going back a couple times to see if I could catch the performative part of it. It didn't really make sense to me until I saw it connected to the performative part of it downstairs, and then it made perfect sense to me. I also liked the artifacts in that show, including the Buffy Sainte-Marie record, which became this sort of portal for me to understand more about her work.
Right.
That the choice of those objects, which was a really interesting curatorial choice that I think we probably made with Joanna Burton. And it just like in this show, it animated the entire environment in a way that suddenly made much more sense to me.
That's great.
It's about movement and it's about rhythm. Even when the objects were static, they seem to be about those things. It's one of the things I really love and enjoy about your work.
And I just one other thing I just want to say is that I think when within the paintings or the sculptures, for instance, like it's color. Color operates in what I was saying before about this kind of glow. So I don't know if you've seen the images of the new sculptures that are currently at De Cordova in Lincoln, Massachusetts. These large fringe sculptures, but they're interesting because they're made from thousands of pieces of fringe. And so all you have to do is, your body creates, like movement when you walk past them. You'll see them slightly move, and you see people glowing on them, and you see like people looking at the kind of like space underneath, and they create a shadow, and that shadow is important. So I think that kind of bodily quality to things, so that they're not static. They're never static.
No, it definitely brought the entire. It actually magnified and put a lens over all of the color and pattern theory that Odili's work delves into. And he was really thrilled with the sound bleed. Something I was a little nervous about, but for him it was a catalytic moment as well as Heather. It really sort of nothing made sense until we turned it up. And I did actually want to talk with you about the affiliation, even though just perhaps titular, to Raymond Carver and the idea of last fragment.
Late fragment.
And the choice, late fragment, and the choice of that, his last work.
Yeah.
Actually, the last poem of his last work.
Well, Raymond Carver, I first learned about Raymond Carver at the Art Institute of Chicago. And so this was 90, probably 3, 4, somewhere around there. And there was a class titled Raymond Carver. And we also wrote short stories. And what was so interesting about Raymond Carver to me was that he wrote about not New York City, not Los Angeles, not even Chicago. He wrote about, for lack of a better word, sort of like Middle America, but there's lots of Middle Americas, right? And people who we're always in a point of transition. He always, the characters in the stories are always so charged and vulnerable. And not that they're always vulnerable, they're just vulnerable in the moment that he's writing about. That's part of this transformation. And yeah, it just sort of stuck with me. I don't think I loved Raymond Carver when I was reading it then, but it's something that I've just returned to. And the brevity, the short story format, for instance, I think because it was also a writing class, I think I assumed it was easier than writing, let's say, like a novel. And I'm not even so concerned whether it's easier or not easier, but it was really hard to kind of like pack a kind of thoughtful narrative into a short story. And so then when I realized, I'm like, oh, he's actually a poet also, then I started reading his poetry. And Late Fragment is very much a different tone than so much of, it's hopeful, it's like, it's loving, it's mortal, for lack of a better word. He started writing these stories that started feeling like he was stepping away from just describing grim reality and writing something more kind of aspirational. So that's what originally drew me to that poem. And I've, to be honest, I've referred to this poem in my work numerous times. I'm going to say this is definitely the first time I've ever titled anything. But there's another piece from a long time ago. I want to say it's probably 2011 or something. And it's titled Nobody Said Anything. And that's from there's lots of Raymond Carver throughout, my work over the last 15 years, for sure. And this piece, it was made during quarantine. So we had to work with performers one by one, and this was at a time when I had made a video previous to this that's a little bit more, it's not as like kind of lively and optimistic as this one is. It's not as hopeful. And I think I got that out of my system. And then I was looking towards nature as a way of kind of grounding myself to continue getting through quarantine and sort of making sense of all of this. And I started talking to other artists and asking them, what they were doing. And everyone seemed to be kind of like finding ways to ground themselves through drumming, through dancing, through being in nature. And that was the moment that I wanted to capture that kind of started off the whole thing. And I just knew, Late Fragment has become sort of not quite a mantra, but maybe you could say, it's kind of a manifesto for me. It's easy to remember, it means so much. And so that's kind of how it all came together. And we made the garments. We shot over probably about 5 weeks, to be honest, because we had to schedule everybody's time. And then the musicians were in town because all their touring had been canceled. So we were able to get these incredible people who would have normally been on tour. And I would explain the idea to them, and everybody was on board. And we shot, the only city location we used was West Bath. We used a space there to shoot most of the music, actually. And then some of the sound was field recordings from different protests. And so the part in the center where you see MX Oops performing independently, kind of in what looks kind of like a dress with the braids, that is from a Black Trans Lives Matter protest. And so that's what that sound clip is in there. And just amazing. I mean, I've worked with the same videographers and sound engineer now on a few videos, and they're just incredible at kind of getting together and understanding what the vibe is I'm trying to accomplish. Everything gets done in parts, and then the editing is really where it all has to come together to make sense. But it is very much about what I would call the kind of main ideas in Late Fragment.
can feel the isolation in it, and part of that is knowing when it was shot. Part of it is this use of split screen
Right.
Throughout, and then when people are together, they are masked. There are these signifiers for that moment that occur throughout it, and then the poem itself, which is a poem that I'm pretty familiar with. I actually really love Raymond Carver, and what's interesting about that poem to me is that it begins actually with two ideas that almost seem opposed to one another, and there's this idea of to call myself beloved,
Mm-hmm.
which is very different than to feel
Yeah.
myself beloved. One sort of collapsing into another, one necessary for the other to occur. It's language that's always hung with me. And then when I saw the video finally at Sigma Jenkins in New York and knew the titular reference, it was an incredibly moving experience for me to see all of those ideas again sort of coalesce into this film that really did again speak to a really specific moment in culture. And then also to a vast swath of history at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm curious, maybe as a last question, about how important is that idea to you, to speak to this moment, but to also speak to history, both the erasure of history and the excavation of certain histories. How important is that to you?
Well, I think, if you had asked me that question, maybe even like, let's say 8 to 10 years ago, I would have said that it's very important to me. And now I think of it differently in that it's just being honest. As I feel like if we look at any object today and we're aware that there are so many different circumstances that bring this object into the context that we're looking at it in, and how those contexts influence how we think what we're looking at, what that object means, what its value is, what its future is, what its impact is. I've grown up. I've been in my adult life. The idea of how to think critically about how history is presented, while not wanting to give up aesthetics and subjective creativity, I think is really what's formed just what I refer to as like just being honest, And I think, I teach this class at Bard, which is based on Deleuze's book, The Fold, which is a really difficult book to teach. But the goal of that class is to understand that any object you pick up has a story, right? And it has a past, whether it's, we could look at our iPhones, what is all the research that it took for the iPhone to evolve? What is the natural resource cost of iPhone's existence? What is the future in landfills of iPhones and technology? Like, what has it done to our learning and how we perceive the world? And this is what I ask my students to think about. It's like in such a fast-paced world where we accept that, a phone is a phone and a pen is a pen and a computer is a computer. It's really that kind of honesty of observing and spending time and understanding how it arrived here and what its future is. That is the real bigger picture of what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, it's Proust. I mean, it's the ability of any given thing to elicit a history, a personal history, a cultural history, all at one time. The film is again beautiful, and does that, I think, for a pretty vast audience, I'm finding.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll tell you that's really important to me, and this was a thing that I talked to Colleen Smith about, because we showed a film of hers that was pretty durational. It was about 19 minutes, and people were sitting through the entire thing which for a human being right now is an amazing thing. People are going in, sitting down, and then they'll leave as an entire group together. So it's been really gratifying for our audience and an honor for us.
Yeah.
And
Great to hear.
thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And thanks for your time today. And we will hopefully talk again soon. I would like that.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Thank you so much for inviting me today.